This is a Changed Physician, episode 241. Welcome back to the Changed Physician. I am Melissa Katie, the Challenge Doctor, with my co-host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro, to bring you happiness. Oh, let's talk about the three elements of happiness. Kevin, why don't you tell the audience what we're referring to or where we're getting this from, maybe what we're talking about.
Sure. So over the last several months, I have been kind of surreptitiously through social media, and stuff like grabs you, and the algorithm chooses what it thinks that you need to see, or maybe actually
to make you happy.
Better, what makes what you want to see. And apparently it knows. It's like, oh, you, Dr. Cuccaro, maybe have been having some apathy and dissatisfaction in life. And yes, I have. I don't know how the algorithm knows all this. And this is, we kind of talked about it off air before we put it on here. And this has been something that has been going on for me for over a year now, I would say. And, people, oh, you're depressed. Well, I'm not depressed. Depression has anhedonia, which is the lack of pleasure. And then another aspect of it is profound apathy. So nothing matters, nothing feels good, and nothing's ever going to get better. And what I've been feeling intermittently is sense of apathy, nothing really matters. It's like, well, why am I doing anything anymore? Part of it, I think, had to do with the transition I went from kind of my consulting education, where it was my own thing, and then I stepped more into an employed role, which is a whole different dynamic. And then you're like, well, something that I thought was going to be my life's work isn't my life's work anymore. So I don't know, existential crisis, we'll put it whatever it is. And so with that apathy, one of the other things I was looking at was, well, happiness and how do you combat apathy, which will be another episode sometime, because it's very interesting. That's the thing, is when you start looking up apathy and how to combat it, as anything, the most challenging things, there's very, very little stuff. And most of it, you're like, oh, you do know that what you're recommending is sort of the reason that the apathy is there. It's I don't know. It's like the recommendation is do this, despite the fact that you don't want to do that, and you're not right. It's it kind of becomes a circular argument. Anyway, I stumbled on this elements of happiness thing. And what I like about that is, instead of people will just say, well, they use a word, happiness. And me, particularly over the last 10 to 15 years, I'm like, well, what does that mean? When we're discussing happiness, what's the context? What's the definition of it? And so this gentleman, Arthur Brooks, who is a professor at Harvard, apparently, and he's got this class on happiness, which I've just recently enrolled in, so that'll be kind of interesting. But he kind of deconstructed, again, if you know me, that's a big buzzword for me, happiness into three particular elements. Instead of happiness being this thing, there's actually these three elements that come together to create or construct an experience of happiness. And those three elements being enjoyment, satisfaction, and purpose. And when you have then enjoyment, satisfaction, and purpose in varying different degrees, then this experience of happiness is what you're kind of living in. That's the other thing about people tend to think as happiness is a destination. And literally all the literature doesn't say that. You can never get somewhere and that's where you're happy.
Yeah.
Instead, happiness is a verb. It's not a noun. And so it's this process of going through something, or maybe you successfully overcame something, and then you have this feeling that develops out of it. So when you start looking at the elements, and what I love about deconstructing anything, whether it's pain, whether it's happiness, whether it's pleasure, whether it's love, whatever, if you can start feeling what are the things that put it together, you can start then adjusting and tempering those individual components in such a way that you can kind of have leveraged effects on the entire experience, and it gives you a greater sense of control in what you're going to do next. So for me then, I'm looking at happiness and enjoyment and satisfaction and purpose. And the biggest one that home to me was purpose, because purpose and apathy are strongly linked. When you feel there's no purpose, apathy tends to increase. So this particular YouTube video that I happened to watch as I was doing my exercise today, one of my exercises, which is something that I'm not apathetic about, and is one of my few senses of profound joy other than my family. And we should probably link to it for here, is these questions about happiness from a Twitter thread. Really, really good. I find if I'm taking notes from something that's a 15-minute video in my perspective, that's how I rate it as good, because it's usually either new information or presented in such a way that I find very useful. Mm-hmm. So we can link that in the show notes here.
Okay. Yeah.
But he mentioned purpose. And then, so, purpose. And then people are, well, what is my purpose, right? So even if you kind of look in the entrepreneurial journey and they're talking about purpose, who's your tribe, who are you serving or whatever, finding what your purpose is can be very difficult. And if you're just asking yourself, well, what's my purpose? That's a huge question. Well, what is my purpose? Like, what is it?
Yeah.
So he had a really brilliant way to kind of narrow this down, to define what your purpose is, which is this overarching sense, something that is bigger than you. The two questions he said to ask were, why am I alive? Which is a big one. And the second one would be, for what would I be willing to die? And so you have sort of the positive and the negative. You're kind of framing it in both a positive and a negative manner. And then you can use those two questions to sort of define those things that are of such profound importance to you. They're beyond just a sense of you themselves, right? This is a true purposeful moment for you. And I haven't sat, since this was lower this morning when I saw this, I have not sat down and put a ton of time on it. But the things that immediately came to mind for me were things like family. Like, I love my family. They are huge. Yeah. And my children and things like that. The other one about for what I would be willing to die for, that was another interesting one, because there's a part where you think, well, I would do this. But then there's another part saying, well, no, sit back and actually then spend some moments of time, actually imagine it is a life or death scenario. Like, not because a lot of people, oh, I'll die for this. So I die for you. I would die for you. Isn't that what Prince said? You know, you don't remember the Prince song? Do you remember that? I would die for you.
Yes, I do.
You want me to, right? And really, Prince probably wouldn't die.
I know a lot of the Prince songs. I just don't ever remember the words all the time. 1999.
So, yeah, so that's a big one. Is like, for what would you be willing to die? And the easy one is my kids, my wife, my family, friends. Is for sure. But there's got to be, like, what principles would really be there? Yeah. So that's my next few days of contemplation on, is I want to try to find out is why am I alive? I may not be able to figure that one out. But then what am I willing to die for? At least provide some kind of constructive things and provide some hints about other things. And some of this, I think, is, as we talked about on our Saturday Salutations. If you guys haven't seen our Saturday Salutations, they're live on Facebook, usually every Saturday, sometimes they're Sunday. Yeah. We had a little talk about, like, age. So I'm depending on when this is actually published, I should be, or right around the age of 50, as my birthday is coming up really, really soon. And maybe this episode's coming up after that. And it's a very interesting time where you're transitioning into, some people have this existential dread when it comes to 50. I don't have any existential dread when I'm 50. I kind of think is exciting because it's a marker birthday for me. It's this round number that provides this kind of endpoint and also a beginning for whatever the next phase is. And as I've talked about on several of the Saturday Salutations, like, we are at the end of, starting this fall, we're going to be empty nesters. My youngest will be heading off to college. We are assisting them through college. That's my goal, is to let them get through college without any debt. But when they're done, so literally within the next 5 to 6 years, well, actually shorter than that, within the next little plus 4 years, we're to whatever we're going to do next. Right. And so that kind of next phase in the journey, then really undertaking it in a way that I've never been aware of in the past. So, high school, you get done with high school. And if you're in a family like mine, you knew you were going to go to college, and then you go to college, and then it's like, what are you going to do next? Well, I kind of punt that down the road, because then I'm like, I'm going to go to medical school. So then you go to medical school, and you got residency. What's after residency? Well, I was in the Navy. Actually, I did a fellowship, and then I was in the Navy. So then the next thing is like, well, what am I going to do when I'm out of the Navy? Well, then we're going to move to Oregon. And then there was some kind of interesting things in that journey. But it's one of those phases, though, where then being less reactionary. I now have 4 years, and I've already spent at least almost 2 years doing this, of like really being conscious about, well, how am I going to start crafting the elements that I want, or at least preparing myself to be in the best place possible when this new transition occurs. And so linking it all back, happiness is one of those things. If you look at the data on people and I think they showed it in that one as well, the happiness curve. There's this period of life, generally you're happiest in your 20s, then it starts going down, and then it starts to bottom out in your mid to late 40s, where people tend to be the least happy that they've ever been. But if you can make it through that, and make it through until you get to basically your early 50s, then it starts to go up again, and it tends to then peak again, or it gets the highest has been around 70, 75. He did mention there's two groups that it doesn't. That's when people have unrequited substance abuse and untreated mental illness. So if you are in those two categories and you don't have treatment, then your happiness kind of tends to not either plateau or get worse. But if you don't have those two issues, generally, if you are in this point where you're potentially turning 50, and I'm going to say this to all my friends if you're ever watching this, and you are in these doldrums and you're like, wow, things just don't seem very good anymore. Well, one, look at, go study the problem and find the evidence, because we're in this, you can find this stuff. And hopefully we'll talk about this more as we go through in future sessions. But the other part, if you don't want to do that, is just recognize that all the data says, as long as you make it through 50 and you're hitting in your early 50s, then it starts to going back up again. So yeah, you can either play the averages, or you could be a little bit more aggressive and actually go in and investigate the work there. That's a super long way to say 3 elements of happiness. Figure out, understand what those 3 elements are, start deconstructing those components in such ways that you can apply them. And if you're in the 50 and you're feeling a little bit apathetic and a little existential, don't worry, folks, that's totally normal. And just kind of join us on the journey, as at least one of us is going through that. And we'll talk about it on future episodes.
Yeah. Well, did they say anything, differentiate enjoyment versus satisfaction? How did they lay that out?
Well, they did, and but I've been so focused on the purpose part, I'd have to go back and kind of
Look at it.
Look at
everyone look at. We'll put a link in there so they can go.
Yeah.
Find it themselves.
So I'm there's another article on here is between enjoyment and pleasure, right? So the different so enjoyment is not the same thing as pleasure, right? So I guess the way I would superficially address this is the difference between enjoyment and pleasure is sort of the difference between suffering and pain, right? So there's a big debate, being us as pain specialists, is like pain and then there's suffering. And some people will tell you can't do anything. It just makes me burn even saying it. Some people do. There's nothing you can do about the pain, which is not true. The only thing that you can actually control is the suffering that's associated with it, right? I think act in its traditional manner. That's what they'll typically say. And that depends on what your definition of pain is. But if we use that sort of analogy, that there you have like this more primary sensory component, or primary, when you're thinking about pain and you're thinking it more on pure of a unpleasant sensory experience aspect, then pleasure would be the primary pleasurable sensation component to it. Enjoyment has an element of pleasure to it, but it isn't pure that, because you can have, like, imagine enjoyment has a sense of, there's going to be sensation. There's generally something that's going to feel good about it. But then there's a sort of overarching theme of something that you've pursued through your own effort. It's more active as compared to pure pleasure, which is can be more passive. Like if you're sitting there just getting a massage, that can be very pleasurable, right? But there's not a lot of activity on your part. If you are doing something, I'm going to use exercise because I'm really enjoying that, where you're doing something and say you're getting a runner's high. There's an element of pleasure associated with it, but there's an active base that becomes a very enjoyable experience for you, because there's this more active control induced scenario with it as well. So that's the enjoyment side. And then the other piece of being satisfaction, let me look, I have to go look and see what the pieces about that as well. We just started doing on
spot. I was just thinking, God, they seem so similar.
Well, they do, and that's they do, and that's one of the things that I think it's really important to, when you're doing a deep engagement with material. There's the passive, superficial role, where you hear a word and you're like, oh yeah, I know what that is. That's so easy. Oh, Dr. Cuccaro, you're saying enjoyment, satisfaction, and purpose are the elements. I know that. That's perfect. I have all of those, right? And maybe you do. But the deeper element, well, what does each of those elements actually mean? So just like you did. Well, what's the difference between enjoyment and pleasure? Because if you're superimposing pleasure as enjoyment in the way that we're sort of using as defined here, and this is really from Arthur Brooks' definition, which I kind of like, then we're not talking about the same thing. And then being able to then investigate each of those elements, and then being able to really firmly understand what word we're using and why we're using that word, what the meaning of the word is, and the concepts that are embedded within that word use, so that we're kind of succinct, or so we're sort of overlapping here, allows us to actually communicate much more effectively and make sure that we're working on the same thing, if that totally making sense.
Without reading that article, what comes to mind for me is enjoyment is something it's like, you enjoy it, like you say, kind of in a passive way. But when I think of being truly satisfied, like true satisfaction, I feel like it's meeting a subconscious or conscious need of yours. That there's something deeper to it that's like, you really needed that. Like it really satisfies you in some way, whether you're knowing it's going to or like unconscious. What were you going to say?
Well, I was going to say, because you're comparing two of the elements, enjoyment and satisfaction.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Oh, but you need both of them.
Right.
Oh, okay. I thought you were like the difference between. I thought you were like the difference between them. Okay.
No, I'm saying
I was miscommunicating.
Yeah, no. Like I'm thinking enjoyment is at this superficial level, but the satisfaction, like you need that part for it. It has like a deeper effect on you, where it's like it's probably fulfilling. And I don't know what it says in there, but I feel like it's fulfilling some deep need of yours. Whether it's you knew that you needed it or you didn't know, but that it's like, even though you need both, I'm saying like, if you only have enjoyment, but you don't have the satisfaction, it's not really meeting a need of yours, and you're missing something.
Yeah. And that's sort of the difference between something that's called hedonic pleasure and eudaimonic pleasure. Those are the kind of the Greek words. When people hear hedonism, that's more pleasure oriented. And there isn't really a meaning or satisfaction that's associated with it, like enjoyment with satisfaction and then purpose being happiness. Hedonic is just pure out pleasure. And you can get pure out pleasure from eating something, like eating
food,
just junk food that gives you this like a sugar rush, maybe pleasurable, but there's no satisfaction that's associated with it. Someone would feel guilt behind it. Where this kind of eudaimonic part, that there's actual meaning. And there is something, I would even put the word useful about it. There's something that you grow with. I'm trying to use my word use here, because when you start looking about meaningful, but typically, and at least in my sort of world, kind of infer this growth aspect, that there's something more than just the components there. And so I think that's what you're getting at. That's what the key is because it's not just, so if you want to simplify it and we just move out enjoyment and we move out satisfaction, we move out purpose, and we just want to say like pleasure. If you don't have pleasure with meaning, and that meaning doesn't have positivity associated with it, and there isn't something more to it, I would say it would be very difficult to be happy, because you can do something that just gives you a burst of, of pleasure, or in a very bastardized way. I don't like to do this when people are like dopamine surge, or really it's more of an endogenous opioid surge. So biomechanical thing that maybe flushes you, gives you a reaction, makes your heart rate go higher, makes vasodilation, and all those elements that we would come together and kind of say very highly pleasurable. You can have all those things and it may actually have no meaning or no deeper component to it, and may actually be harmful long term. If you're thinking something like maybe heroin, which wouldn't be, you wouldn't say, well, the injection of heroin gives you happiness. It's probably the reverse of that, because the guilt and things are associated with it. But so there's more to it than just, I don't know, more to it than just pleasure, for sure. And there's a lot of things that you can do that I would say construct happiness, but may actually be not necessarily pleasurable in the most superficial definition of the word. Again, exercise being a very good term. If you are an avid exerciser, or those people who are doing like Iron Men or Iron Women things, you're going to push yourself through a wall. And that may be very noxious information going to your brain, burning sensations, like your stamina is not there, but being able to push through and overcome then that actual sensation, which most people would say would be not pleasurable or noxious, can actually be associated with a very pleasurable, happiness, meaningful experience for them.
Yeah. No, I can say that from, not that I've done ultra marathons or anything like that, but plenty of other physical activity that seems grueling to the outside observer, but you derive a lot of satisfaction and meaning from the challenges you set forth for yourself and achieve it.
Yeah,
So,
even like pushing a weight, right? So if you've ever been a weightlifter and you first time you lift a weight that you've never lifted before, that typically isn't like, you feel usually good when it's under, but it's pretty damn strenuous when you're trying.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are good questions there. Plus on calling them out. Okay. What's the difference between enjoyment and pleasure? What's the difference between satisfaction and, I don't know, what's satisfaction? Some other word for satisfaction there.
Fulfilled.
Yeah, well, that
Maybe.
one's a tough one. I'd have to actually spend some time on that because my suspicion is
Feel contentment.
Yeah, maybe contentment and satisfaction.
You know what makes me think of, and I'm not going to give it any direct example, but people that might find enjoyment out of making other people miserable, or they're driven by ego, money, power. It'd be interesting to see how you would correlate that, as if, like, do they in some weird way find they're super happy and subconscious, like what's going on in that? Like if they could really be happy doing this to people, depending on how they frame it.
So I think it's a frame, unless you're talking about like a sociopath.
Yeah.
And because sociopath, one of the kind of key components, if I remember correctly, of sociopathy is like lack of empathy, where they don't have the ability to feel. And then they become like chameleons because then they're mirroring it because they know they need it, but they don't have that empathy. So well, in the worst terms, they'll kill you, but a lot of times they can do stuff to you where somebody else would say, how could you do that? They don't have any feeling associated with it. They just do it because it is beneficial.
It fills their own needs.
Yeah. So there's lack of that sort of empathy there. On other people though, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's a frame. Nobody is running around thinking that they're the bad guy.
Yeah.
No matter who you are, like Putin is as much of a dumbass that guy is, and as much pain and terror and awfulness that he's going, unless he's a pure sociopath, is very likely constructed a narrative where he believes that he's doing the right thing.
Yeah.
In some way, because it is very, very difficult to navigate a process where you're doing something that you believe is evil, while at the same time that you believe you're good, right? That dissonance is and we've talked about cognitive dissonance, I think, in other episodes. So I think a lot of these people create these narratives that everybody's the hero of their own story.
They're protecting themselves.
They protect themselves. And you wish that there was a way, in some ways, that when people are doing things that are unethical, immoral, cruel, pure self-interest, like how would you turn the mirror on them? Because if they actually had that mirror, and again, they're not a sociopath, then there's at least a person that they may have some behavioral change, or they can react, because now we're again talking about beliefs, which I think we just talked about in an episode or two ago. And when you beliefs resist, beliefs hate it when they have to be changed. They are activated when your beliefs, something misaligns with your belief and that distance comes up, then they will get activated. You can tell your heart rate goes up, and having somebody aware enough then to recognize that their beliefs are being activated, and then being aware enough to be willing enough to face them, and then change or adapt, or at least learn from them. That's a whole nother journey there. But that's a long way to say is most people, like the people that you're talking about, they construct a narrative.
Yeah.
They construct a narrative. And how often do we do it, right? So something wrong happens to us, And if you're human, what we'll typically, this person is horrible, this person is, they did this, and then we start looking for things that confirm what those beliefs may be. Oh yeah, they're selfish because they did X, Y, and Z, or they're not as good because they did Z, A, and B. And what we're doing is we're basically reinforcing our frames that allow us to proceed with actions and feelings that are aligned with what we want to be true in many scenarios.
Yeah.
The difficult part is, even in the most adverse situations, if you're dealing with somebody who's not a sociopath, is to recognize that they're human too.
Mhm.
And they may be doing bad things, but at the bottom of it, they believe they're not a bad person.
Yeah.
So then how then can you move in that realm to get them to see that their actions, well, I guess is to figure out what those underlying, what they believe to be true, to identify what their actions are that are actually counter to their beliefs about them, they're a good person. Does that make any sense? Well, you're trying to, and now I'm just like actively problems, like, oh, how would I do that? Like, how would you do that?
Well, I guess what's your goal? I mean, what are you trying to achieve? Are you just trying to get them to just see your side, or
change their behavior, or it's
first
really
you got to
about
know, do you think they really care?
persuasion? Huh?
Or
Well,
do they really
that's it. Well, everybody cares about themselves,
well, we know that.
right? And so if you go by the old so Ben Franklin kind of things is, he had this persuasion strategy with people, his worst enemies, where he would ask them for a favor. Hey, let me borrow a book or whatever. And there was a beautiful quote. I can't remember exactly, so I'm going to paraphrase it really, really badly. But basically, he who's done you a favor is more likely to do you a good in the future, right? And from dissonance theory, it makes sense, because if you have somebody who doesn't like you, or somebody that you're having a bad relationship with, and then you ask them for even a small favor in something else,
Mhm.
they now have to align that small good behavior of helping you to align with the new beliefs of, oh, you know what, Melissa is actually not a bad person. She asked me, I thought Melissa was a horrible person, but she asked me for a copy of that book that I really liked. So, and I gave it to her. So either she's a bad person and it makes me a bad person because I helped her, or maybe she's not a bad person as I thought. I mean, literally, that's what he did. He would borrow books from his political enemies, and he would kind of transition them into being friends through these small acts of asking them for a favor, which is the exact opposite. Most people say, well, you can't ask your enemies a favor.
People give the gift to that person.
They give the gift. Yeah. Versus asking them something.
Yeah. Because you kind of put them on. Yeah. That's an interesting flip to what people would think.
But when you look at the science behind it, again, particularly with dissonance, it makes a lot of sense. It actually makes a lot, because here's the other thing. When you give someone something, that act of reciprocity now implies a burden on the other person. So you can use reciprocity in such a way, if you give a gift, then people feel obligated to give you something back. Most people don't want to feel obligated.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it is. I mean, that man, I need to go actually read his biographies more, because it's like, he was a freaking genius. He was a genius. That guy was a genius. Invented all this stuff, and like the Franklin stove, and wrote just all this masterful stuff. And anyway, someone to study.
Yeah. I remember seeing some kind of like credo, or like list of the 13 things that
the virtues, and you would spend a week on each virtue and rotate.
I printed that out and put it above my bed in my first year in college. It's been a long time since I've seen them.
Is it still above your bed now?
No. I don't know where that list went, but anyway. Well, cool. Well, anything else you'd like to add to this conversation? I guess maybe a quick summary and take us out, or?
Well, I would say, when it comes to like happiness, purpose, and particular age, what I would really appreciate, from whether you're watching this on YouTube or you're watching it or listening to it through your earbuds, again, send us your experience about this. This is for me personally, this is something I'm really interested in learning more of, because of of the magic 5-0 in this transition period. So what are your thoughts on happiness? What are the things, what did you appreciate when it comes to the elements of what we discussed here? If you watched the YouTube video, which is in the link, which I'm going to just give you the name just in case you're listening to this, which is Harvard Professor Answers Happiness Questions from Twitter. This is published by Wired. It was on YouTube. Send your thoughts, or what do you think about this discussion? What do you think we're missing, or I'm missing? Because I would love to have that dialogue. This is, again, I think this is a really interesting topic, and it kind of moves into a lot of living well at a point where you're no longer thinking of how am I going to survive or what next. And so it's the next evolution of living in the human experience. And it's fascinating to me. So I want to hear your thoughts on that. You can email those directly to me at drkevin@thechangedphysician.com. You can post in the YouTube video. And as always, stay well until the next little talk we have.
All right. Take care.